Margaret sat by the wide front window of her home in Vermont, her eyes following the golden leaves drifting across the yard. The house was filled with silence, a kind of silence that pressed against her chest and reminded her of all that was missing. Years had passed since her husband died. Yet she still felt the weight of his absence in the simplest of things: the empty chair across the table, the untouched side of the bed, the quiet dinners where only her fork scraped the plate. She had grown used to it, but there were days like this autumn afternoon, when loneliness felt heavier than usual. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea she had brewed. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, trying to steady herself. Outside, children's laughter carried faintly from the street, their joy a sharp contrast to the stillness in her living room. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, wishing she could borrow some of that energy, that carefree spirit. But her life had shifted into slower rhythms. There was no reversing time. Her son Daniel had been visiting more often lately. He was in his early 30s, tall and thoughtful, a man who carried both his father's quiet strength and his own gentle kindness. Margaret noticed how he filled the house with small, unnoticed acts, fixing the loose cupboard door, replacing light bulbs, carrying in heavy bags from the car. He didn't make a fuss about it, but his presence always softened the weight of her days. She told herself he was simply being a good son. But a part of her couldn't help sensing something more in his eyes when he looked at her, an emotion that lingered just beyond words. That afternoon, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway reached her ears. Margaret's heart lifted a little. She stood, smoothed her sweater, and opened the door just as Daniel walked up with a small bag of groceries in his hands. "I thought you could use a few things," he said with a smile, stepping inside. His smile carried warmth, but also something unspoken, as if he was holding back thoughts he couldn't easily share. They moved into the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of unpacking and setting things in place, easing the silence between them. Daniel asked about her day, and she answered with simple details: her morning walk, the neighbor's new puppy, the book she had started reading. He listened closely, the way he always did, as though every word mattered. She found comfort in that, in being seen, in being heard. When the groceries were done, they sat together at the table. The late afternoon sun spilled across the wooden surface, painting everything in a golden glow. Margaret sipped her tea while Daniel stirred his coffee slowly, his thoughts clearly somewhere else. She wanted to ask what was on his mind, but she waited. Over the years, she had learned he spoke in his own time. For a while, they simply sat in the warmth of the moment, the ticking clock filling the space between them. Margaret felt a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. A peace that came not from solitude, but from presence, the presence of someone who cared. She glanced at her son, noticing how much he resembled his father, yet carried a gentleness that was entirely his own. The sight stirred something inside her, a mix of pride, love, a quiet ache she couldn't name. Daniel finally set his spoon down and looked at her with a seriousness that caught her off guard. His eyes lingered, filled with a depth she wasn't used to seeing. Margaret felt her breath pause, waiting for words she sensed would not be ordinary. In that fragile stillness, surrounded by the golden light of autumn, she realized this afternoon would not pass like all the others. Something unspoken was about to be said, and whatever it was, she knew it would stay with her long after the leaves outside had fallen. The kitchen felt unusually quiet as the late afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, casting long shadows across the table. Margaret sat opposite Daniel, her tea untouched, the steam curling upward before fading into the air. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands clasped loosely around his coffee mug. His eyes were thoughtful, his expression distant, as though he was rehearsing words inside his head. Margaret had seen this look before he wore it when he had something heavy to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. She waited, patient, her fingers lightly tapping the rim of her teacup. She had always been careful not to press him. He was like his father in that way, needing space before revealing what lay in his heart. The ticking of the wall clock filled the pause, steady and almost too loud in the stillness. Margaret thought about filling the silence with a question. Perhaps something simple about work or his friends. But before she could, he spoke. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice soft yet firm, I don't like seeing you alone all the time." The words startled her, not because of their content, but because of the emotion threaded through them. He spoke with a mix of concern and determination, as though he had thought about this for a long while. Margaret shifted in her chair, trying to keep her tone light. "That's very sweet of you to say, Daniel. But I'm fine. I've managed for years now." Daniel shook his head gently. "That's just it. You've managed. But managing isn't the same as living. You deserve more than quiet rooms and empty days. You deserve someone by your side, someone who looks after you, someone who makes you smile." His words lingered in the air, pressing into her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. Margaret had told herself she was content, that she had accepted her life as it was. Yet hearing Daniel say aloud what she had tried to bury made something shift inside her. She felt both seen and exposed at the same time. Finally, she managed a laugh, though it sounded weaker than she intended. "That's kind of you, Daniel. But at my age, it's not so simple. Things like that don't just happen anymore." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers, steady and unwavering. "Then let me be that someone, at least until you find the happiness you deserve." The words fell into the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret froze, her hand gripping the teacup tighter than before. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. But the sincerity in his expression left no room for doubt. His voice hadn't wavered. His eyes hadn't shifted. He meant every word. Her heart raced, her thoughts tumbling in every direction. This was not the kind of offer a son usually made to his mother. And yet there was nothing careless about his tone. It wasn't playful or casual. It was earnest, almost protective. As if he had decided this long ago and had finally gathered the courage to say it. Margaret's throat tightened. She searched for words but found none. The kitchen clock ticked louder, each second stretching into what felt like a minute. She studied her son's face, hoping for a clue, perhaps a sign that he had spoken in jest, that he would laugh it off. But Daniel didn't move. His gaze remained steady, his shoulders firm, his silence daring her to respond. Finally, she placed her teacup on the table with trembling hands. "Daniel," she whispered, unsure of her own voice, "do you realize what you're saying?" "I do," he replied calmly, though his eyes carried a softness that made her heart ache. "I know it sounds unusual, but I've watched you all these years, Mom. You've given so much, carried so much, and you've been alone for too long. If no one else is here to give you the happiness you deserve, then let me do it. Let me take care of you." The weight of his words pressed heavily against her chest. Margaret wanted to protest, to remind him that she was his mother, that such an offer blurred lines that should never be crossed. Yet something inside her hesitated. It was the way he looked at her, so certain, so full of devotion. It wasn't just the protective love of a son. It carried something deeper, something she couldn't quite name but could feel stirring in her bones. She turned her gaze toward the window, the fading sunlight painting the yard in amber tones. Her reflection stared back faintly in the glass, and she hardly recognized the woman she saw. A woman caught between gratitude, shock, and a confusing warmth she wasn't ready to admit. The silence stretched long between them, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Margaret felt her heart pound louder than those sounds, each beat echoing in her ears. Finally, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now, but no less steady. "You don't have to answer me now. I just wanted you to know how I feel. I don't want you to carry life alone anymore." Margaret swallowed hard, her hands resting in her lap to hide their trembling. She nodded faintly, unable to find words. Her mind spun with questions, doubts, and feelings she dared not say aloud. Part of her wanted to scold him, to remind him of boundaries, to tell him this was not a path they could ever walk. Yet another part of Hertha, part that had been lonely for so long, felt a flicker of warmth at his words. A dangerous warmth she didn't dare acknowledge. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel. That's very thoughtful of you. But inside, Nothing felt simple anymore. As Daniel finished his coffee and rose to wash his cup, Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her thoughts chasing themselves in endless circles. His words had unsettled her, shaking the quiet rhythm of her life in a way she hadn't expected. She knew nothing would be the same again, and as she watched him rinse his cup at the sink, the golden light of evening framing his silhouette, she realized she would carry the weight of his offer long after the dishes were put away. Margaret woke the next morning still replaying Daniel's words in her mind. "Let me be that someone." The sentence had followed her into her dreams, echoing in the quiet corners of her heart. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was nothing more than a son's way of expressing care. But the way he had looked at her, the calm conviction in his voice, it hadn't sounded casual. It had felt heavier, layered with something she couldn't name. She moved through her day as if everything were normal. Yet her thoughts betrayed her. While folding laundry, she remembered the way his eyes had lingered on hers. While making tea, she remembered the warmth in his tone. Even as she watered the plants on the porch, she found herself wondering if anyone had ever spoken to her with such devotion since her husband's passing. The loneliness that had lived quietly in her for years stirred, rising in ways she didn't expect. Daniel arrived that evening carrying a bag of groceries and a bouquet of fresh daisies. "Thought you could use these," he said with an easy smile, setting them on the counter. Margaret's breath caught for a moment. She couldn't remember the last time someone had brought her flowers just because. She thanked him softly, arranging them in a vase, Kaya's fingers trembling slightly as she placed them on the kitchen table. Dinner was simple grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. They ate together, their conversation flowing lightly at first. Daniel asked about her book, about the neighbor's new puppy, about whether she had considered joining a local art class. Margaret answered, though her words came slower than usual. Every time their eyes met across the table, she felt a strange current pass through her. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it unsettled her because she couldn't explain it. After dinner, Daniel insisted on washing the dishes while she dried them. They stood side by side at the sink, their movements quiet and practiced, as though they had done this together for years. Margaret noticed the way his shoulder brushed against hers, the way he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts neither dared to voice. Later, they sat in the living room with cups of tea. The air smelled faintly of daisies and soap, and the soft hum of the refrigerator carried from the kitchen. Margaret tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred on the page. She could feel Daniel's presence beside her, steady and warm, filling the space that had so often felt hollow. Her heart fluttered at small things, the way he leaned closer when showing her something on his phone, the way he laughed gently at her jokes, the way his gaze lingered on her face just a second too long. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was reading too much into gestures born out of care. Yet deep down, she knew something had shifted. That night, till Daniel left, Margaret lingered by the door long after his car had disappeared down the street. The house returned to its silence, but it didn't feel the same. His presence clung to the rooms, filling them with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She carried the vase of daisies into her bedroom and placed them on the nightstand, staring at their bright petals as she lay down. Sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned, hearing his voice in her mind. "You deserve someone by your side." She thought of his father, of the years they had shared, of the comfort of being loved. She also thought of how long it had been since anyone had looked at her the way Daniel had. The realization both comforted and unsettled her. In the days that followed, she watched Daniel with new eyes. When he fixed the squeaky door hinge, when he carried the heavy boxes from the attic, when he surprised her with her favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery, she noticed the care in every gesture. She wondered if she had overlooked this before or if something truly had changed between them. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Margaret caught the way people looked at them. To strangers, they might have seemed like any other pair, enjoying the crisp autumn air together. But in her heart, she felt the weight of his words pressing against every step. She wondered if others could see it's the closeness, it's the unspoken tenderness lingering in the space between them. At night, Alone in her room, she scolded herself for letting her thoughts wander. She was his mother. She had to keep the lines clear. Yet, no matter how sternly she reminded herself, the memory of his offer stayed alive, glowing faintly like embers that refused to die. One evening, Daniel lingered longer than usual after dinner. They sat on the porch, wrapped in sweaters against the chill, watching the stars appear one by one in the sky. The night was quiet, only the distant sound of crickets filling the air. Margaret felt the weight of his presence beside her, close enough that their arms brushed lightly. She wanted to ask him what he had meant that day, wanted to hear him explain again. But her words stuck in her throat. If she asked, she feared the answer. If she didn't, the silence would haunt her, torn between wanting clarity and wanting to preserve the fragile peace. She chose silence. Daniel, too, seemed content to let the night pass without speaking of it. Yet when he turned his head and smiled at her, a soft, knowing smile, Margaret felt her heart skip. It was not the smile of a son humoring his mother. It carried something deeper, something that lingered long after he said goodnight. That night, lying in bed, Margaret finally admitted to herself that she was afraid. Afraid of what his words had stirred. Afraid of the longing she felt but couldn't confess. Afraid of what it meant to let those thoughts grow. Yet, despite her fear, one truth remained clear. She couldn't forget his offer. She couldn't silence the way it had made her feel wanted, seen, cherished. The silence between them wasn't just silence anymore. It was a space filled with questions, unspoken emotions, and the dangerous possibility of something more. The porch was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold its breath. The air was cool, touched with the faint smell of pine drifting from the woods beyond the yard. Margaret sat in her usual chair, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Beside her, Daniel leaned back with a calm ease, his eyes fixed on the sky where the first stars flickered into view. They had been sitting like that for a while, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with words. Margaret found herself listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, the soft sound grounding her more than anything else had in years. The stillness wasn't heavy, it was tender, filled with the quiet comfort of being together. At last, Daniel turned to her. His expression was gentle, but his eyes carried the same weight they had the day he made his offer. "You don't have to give me an answer," he said softly, almost as though he feared breaking the spell of the night. "I just want you to know, you'll never face life alone as long as I'm here." The word struck her like a chord she both longed for and dreaded. Margaret's throat tightened, her chest rising with a sharp breath. She wanted to answer, wanted to tell him everything she felt, but her voice faltered. Instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his. His fingers tightened around hers without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for that single gesture. They sat hand in hand beneath the stars, the silence between them alive with unspoken truths. Margaret's heart thudded with emotions she couldn't name. She knew this moment wasn't ordinary yet, was one of those rare pieces of time that stays etched forever. When Daniel finally rose to leave, he pressed her hand one last time before stepping down the porch steps. "Good night, he said with a warmth that wrapped around her long after he disappeared into the night. Margaret stayed seated, staring at the spot where he had stood, her mind caught in a whirl of thoughts. Was it only devotion speaking through him? The care of a son who couldn't bear to see her lonely? Or was it something deeper, something neither of them dared to define? Days turned into weeks, yet his words never left her. She moved through her routines, tidying the house, cooking simple meals, reading books, but at the edges of everything she did, his voice lingered. "You'll never face life alone as long as I'm here." It was a promise, and it pulsed in her chest like a heartbeat. Every time Daniel visited, she noticed the small ways he kept that promise. He fixed the crooked step on the porch without being asked. He stayed late to help her sort through old photo albums. He brought her favorite pastries on Saturday mornings, always remembering the kind she liked best. Each gesture reminded her of that night, of his vow, of the way his hand had closed around hers with such certainty. Margaret often found herself staring at him when he wasn't looking, searching for answers in his face. Did he know how much those words had changed her? Did he realize how they haunted her evenings, how they made her heart ache with a confusing mix of gratitude and longing? She never asked. She feared asking would break the fragile balance they had built. Years later, when the daisies he once brought had long faded, and the seasons had turned again and again, Margaret still remembered that night as if it were yesterday. She remembered the way the stars looked brighter, the way the night air felt charged with something unspoken, the way his voice had carried both tenderness and weight. She never spoke of it to anyone. It became her secret, a memory she held close, tucked away like a hidden letter in the back of a drawer. She carried it into her quiet evenings, into her sleepless nights, into the moments when loneliness pressed too hard against her chest. His offer, his promise, became a thread she wove through her heart to remind herself she was not forgotten. Sometimes, as she sat again on the porch in the cool evenings, she would close her eyes and feel the ghost of his hand in hers. She would hear his voice, steady, warm, certain, and it would comfort her in ways no other words ever had. She never knew if Daniel had meant more than devotion, if his offer had carried layers she hadn't dared to unfold. All she knew was that it had changed her. It had reminded her that love, in its many forms, could still find her even in the quiet years of her life. And so, though time kept moving forward, though the world around her shifted, that single moment on the porch remained untouched. His unexpected offer still played in her mind, a melody that never faded, a memory she carried with both gratitude and wonder.